Thanks, Graham, and thank you for the invitation. It's nice to be here. And as Graham said, I do feel like I'm becoming a Queenslander, especially commiserating with my friends last night after the match. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about greenhouse gases and agriculture, and the subtitle is Emissions and Solutions in Context. This is work that I'm presenting, but I think it represents the thinking of a lot of people at the Institute for Sustainable Resources, and so I'm speaking a little bit for our group. I think that after hearing this talk, you're going to be able to better understand a lot of the discussions that we hear about greenhouse gases and about greenhouse gases in agriculture. This figure shows over time the emissions of carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels, represented by that gray shaded area, and from land use change. There are two shades of green there. One is from temperate land use change, so land use change in the temperate regions, and one is from the tropics. So you can see that over time emissions have grown, land use change emissions have grown, and that land use change emissions comprise a substantial portion of total emissions. So I want to try and put these emissions in context for general emissions, not just agricultural emissions. And then what I want to do is use that framework to help you understand agricultural emissions. I hope that in doing this we can kind of reach agreement about how we might go forward to reduce those emissions. As importantly, what makes agricultural emissions different from other greenhouse gas emissions. So when we see this figure, I want you to think about what's driving this. We know that it's human-caused activities. We also know that there's a relationship between human population and emissions. This white line superimposed on the figure shows population trends over the same period of time, and you can see that there's some correlation between these two. Now I'm going to try and do something here. I want to look at some other data, and these are data from a website called Gapminder. If you go to gapminder.org, you can access all these data, and the data have been compiled by this research group in the Netherlands. And here we're showing the population versus CO2 emissions. Each of those dots represents a different country, and the color of these dots corresponds to the regions on that map in the top right corner. And so you can see that there is a relationship between the total population and the total amount of emissions. There's fairly good agreement. In a lot of the field experiments that I do, if I got data that looked like this, I'd be very happy with it. So we know that that the population is a driver for emissions. And so what I want to do today is go step by step and derive something that's called the Kaya identity. And this is the first step in deriving that. So what we're doing is we're saying that carbon dioxide emissions are defined as a function of several things. The simplest way to think about this might be to say that it's a function of the number of people and how much CO2 is emitted by the activities that per capita CO2 emissions. But this is overly simplistic. If we look back at this figure, we can see that when we pick a country of a given population, let's pick this one here, a population of over 20 million, this is in 2006, and emissions of 372 million tons carbon dioxide. We can see that when we pick a population level, so countries that fall along this line, we have drastically different emissions. We can scroll down through here and you see a number of different country names pop up that have similar populations, which pops up on the x-axis, but lower emissions, which pops up over here. And we can go all the way down to this country, Afghanistan, which has a larger population, but 500 times less CO2 emission. And so we know that that population alone doesn't explain emissions. So we need something else. And furthermore, if we just simplified things to the extent that we thought population was the main driver, we'd put ourselves in a framework like this, where we identify several problems and solutions. I don't see much head shaking or eye rolling. I was hoping to see a lot, because these aren't really problems, are they? And those aren't really solutions. There was a famous essay by Jonathan Swift that proposed a way to deal with the population problem about 150 years ago. It was called A Modest Proposal, and we could add his solution to our list of solutions: eating our young. It would take care of our emission problems, right? Clearly not. But this, if we just think about that component of the relationship, we fall into this kind of thinking, where these are the problems and those are the solutions. Clearly that's not acceptable to most people most of the time. I have read some essays and proposals where people talk about the ethics of population growth with respect to climate change, and the ethics of imposing population caps to limit greenhouse gas emissions. That's the discussion I don't want to have, but it is part of the equation. But again, there's more to it than that. So we think about emissions varying between different countries, not as a function of population, but as a function of other things. And what are the differences between a country like Australia and a country like Afghanistan? Why are emissions so much higher here? Why are emissions so low in these blue countries from sub-Saharan Africa? It's because it's a richer country. The U.S. is a richer country. And a lot of our emission rates are a function of how affluent we are, how wealthy we are. And so let's change this figure a little bit to include population not just on this axis, but in the size of these dots. And so now the size of these bubbles represent different populations, and so you see big countries up here. And let's change this axis to normalize for population, so CO2 emissions per person. And I want to keep it on a log scale to stretch our data out. But then let's put down here on this axis some information about how wealthy we are, income per person. So both of these axes are log corrected to stretch them out so that the figure's not dominated by the big wealthy countries. And they're both corrected per capita, per person. And we can see again a pretty strong relationship here between the wealth within a country and emission rates per person. The richer countries tend to emit more carbon dioxide than the poorer countries. And so we can add this into our equation. We're not just interested in carbon dioxide per person, but we're interested in how affluent different countries are. And this comes into lots of conversations about controlling greenhouse gas emissions. Most, I think, of the conversations that you read about in the newspaper are focused on this aspect of managing greenhouse gas emissions. People talk about giving things up to reduce emissions, driving less, consuming less, being less wealthy in order to reduce our emissions. And that's one path, but like reducing the number of people or population growth, it's not acceptable to many people. And if you use this as your complete framework for talking about emissions, it really limits your discussion to things that are not acceptable to most people most of the time. But much of the argument that we hear is at high volume talking about these things. So if we go back to this figure again and we look at it in some more detail, I want to highlight two things. One is that we do see this relationship, but it's not really a flat line relationship. It changes over time. And I want to pick out a couple examples here. Three of the most interesting countries. And what I want to do is look at changes over time. So this is, again, the same information, income per person, a measure of our affluence, and emissions per person. And we selected these three countries, and I took it back in time to 1960. And what I'm going to do is run forward, and we can watch the progression of these three and how the relationship between income per person and CO2 emissions has changed over time. And this will just take a second. And what you can see is that, first of all, it's changed over time, right? The locations of those dots changed. Second, you can see that there's a general trend this way and some trend this way. And this tells us that these countries have been growing wealthier over time, and that generally, at least for Australia and the U.S., they've been emitting more CO2 per person over time. But also that France was following the same path and had taken a different path more recently. So there's some other things going on here. And then if we deselect those, so that's one thing to remember. If we deselect those then and we focus just on these green countries, so the Middle East and North Africa, I'm not sure if my mouse will stay in place, but you can see that if you draw a line to represent these points, that these green dots, these green countries from the Middle East and North Africa, tend to fall above that line. It costs them more emissions to reach a certain level of affluence. And what do those countries have in common? They're in places that are endowed with petrochemicals. And so there are two things here that we need to additionally consider in our explanation of CO2 emissions. And they're a function of energy. So really, this part of the equation shouldn't be about how much CO2 is emitted or how much CO2 it costs us to gain affluence. It's about how much energy we use to gain affluence. And then the next part, the final part, is about how CO2 intensive energy is. So the different sources of energy. Some release a lot of CO2 per unit energy released. Some release less, or none, or almost none. But this, as it's called, the Kaya identity, helps us understand these different arguments. And so you'll hear people talking about energy efficiency or energy intensity. Both the U.S. and China in their negotiations have largely focused on this. Bush and Jintao set goals for this. They want to continue to grow our affluence, but they want to do it more efficiently. Depending on how fast these grow, that could lead to increased emissions or decreased emissions. But this is a nice metric to focus on. It's all about energy efficiency, growing wealthier with using less energy. Obama talks a little bit more. He's made some investments in clean energy. What he wants to do is decarbonize our energy sources. So conversations about this are focused on where we get our energy. It comes from the socket in the wall, but what's behind that? Is it a coal-fired power plant, or is it solar or hydro? What drives that? In France, they get a lot of their energy from nuclear power, and that's the reason for that divergence in CO2 emissions in France, because they made a decision to, it wasn't for CO2 reasons, but they made a decision to focus on nuclear energy, so they get a large proportion of their energy from nuclear. So understanding this framework helps us understand all the discussions about emission reductions. It's simplistic, it leaves things out, it's incomplete, but it really helps us understand the meaning of what's behind what people are saying. And it's really just these four factors that drive CO2 emissions. Population, the affluence or economic prosperity, the energy intensity, how much energy it costs us to gain wealth, and the carbon intensity of those energy sources. And adjusting all these things has an influence on our emissions. Now, what I want to do today is to talk about the food production and agricultural emissions, and how this framework can help inform how we understand agricultural emissions and what we can do about them. So first off, one of the take-home messages is that agriculture is different. It's more complex. We're talking about a lot of different kinds of emissions from different sources. There's a whole lot rolled up within the agricultural sector. And accounting for these emissions isn't simple. Agriculture is an important source of emissions. If you look at the direct agricultural emissions, so primarily methane and nitrous oxide from activities that happen in the field, and also from rice, that's something like 10 to 12% of total global emissions. If you include land use change in your estimate of agricultural emissions, it might be something like 25% of total emissions, 30% of total emissions, because this is a big source. Whether you attribute that all to agriculture or not is another question. But then there are all the other things that are associated with food production. Transport of food, refrigeration of food, processing of food, disposal of waste. And so depending on how you define the agricultural sector, agricultural and food-related emissions can be rather large. So how do we modify this equation to revise the identity to talk about agriculture? First, we're not just interested in affluence. We're interested in food production. And so we discuss this in terms of food produced rather than wealth generated. Second, this use of energy is important in agriculture. Agricultural emissions from doing things like driving tractors around the field, performing operations on farm, keeping animals warm, all kinds of things require direct use of energy. And this is important. But it's not the only source of greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. There are other greenhouse gas emissions, as that previous figure showed. And so we need to account for those as well. And so we can think of modifying our equation like this, where we talk about the energy required to produce a given amount of food and the source of that energy. Is it clean energy? Is it generated from biogas or hydro? Or what's the source of that energy? And that's important. But also we have to think about these other greenhouse gases, the direct emissions from nitrous oxide and methane release. And for this formulation, the units for these are the same, so we can add those together and make an estimate of greenhouse gas emissions. So it's really 5 factors that are important for agriculture. The population is important. The prosperity, how much food we consume, is important. And so as Graham mentioned, in the future we're going to need more food. Populations are growing. As people become more affluent, they want to consume more food. As people become more affluent, they want to consume different food that requires more inputs to produce. And the sources of energy that we use in agriculture are important, and the amount of energy that we use, but also this last term, this idea of greenhouse gas intensity, the greenhouse gases produced per unit food, is important. So I don't want to talk about people. Those solutions are difficult to list with a straight face. Clearly, food consumption could decrease in some places for some people, but for the world as a whole, there are a lot of hungry people. And I envision a future in which there's more food produced than there is now. And so I would say that food consumption is increasing, food production is increasing, and overall that's a good thing. And I think it needs to continue. What about energy production used in food? In developing countries, there have been some declines recently. Energy is costly, and so people tend to use energy increasingly efficiently. And that's true in agricultural energy use as well, and there have been some declines. I haven't seen any data on what's happening in developing countries. It's forecast that much of the increase in food production is going to happen in the developed countries. And so understanding the efficiency of energy use between developing and developed countries is important. It seems that it might be increasing. Until recently, globally, there's been some slow improvement in decarbonization of our energy sources. And this has been driven by, not usually by a desire to reduce CO2 emissions, but for other reasons. For example, the decisions that were made in France to support nuclear power and broaden nuclear power, investments that were made a long time ago. And the other primary important example is what's happened in the UK. They're running out of coal that's cheaply locally available. And so what's happening there is there's a substitution of coal-fired power plants with natural gas. Natural gas is becoming relatively cheaper for them. And it produces more energy per unit CO2 release, and so there's some efficiency gain there. And those kind of things have been happening. But over the past 10 years, 15 years, much of the world's growth has been in areas that are more dependent on dirtier fuel. And so globally, the expectation had been that the energy supply system would naturally decarbonize. But that hasn't happened because of where the growth has been. And then this last item, which is where my research focus is, and the research of the other folks at the Institute for Sustainable Resource focus, and that's on greenhouse gas intensity. And really this is fundamental work, but thinking about it in terms of greenhouse gas intensity is kind of new. Most of the discussion that we see about agricultural emissions, carbon management, takes place in the absence of discussions about food. And when we talk about intensity, we're explicitly talking about food production and thinking about ways to produce food more efficiently, rather than seeking a net reduction in greenhouse gases. So as I said, there are a lot of complexities in agricultural systems. One of the obvious ones is that there are very few or fewer point sources for emissions from agriculture, and that makes things difficult. At the Institute for Sustainable Resources, we're doing work in a few different areas, and I want to just mention two. One is in biosequestration, and the idea is that a lot of these losses of carbon from our ecosystems that have happened in the past can be reversed, and carbon can be stored in these systems. And again, this is a big, it's about 20% of global emissions. It's important. And so this is a graphic illustration of what's happened in the past. This is a picture from a Landsat image of Rondônia State in Brazil, taken in 1975. And it's green, meaning it's covered with forest. I did some work with some colleagues there. We did some soil sampling several years ago, and I went to that town, Araquaimas, and I had a guidebook with me, and the guidebook called the road that you can see there, that white line, the single most destructive act of engineering in the history of the world, because it led to this, deforestation on a large scale. If you look at Google Earth, and if you look at the whole continent of South America on your computer screen, you can see this area. It's a big change in land use, and it's had an impact. It's had a big release of soil carbon, and this is what it looks like afterwards. And so what's happening in these systems, and this has happened historically in the developed world. It's happening more now in the developing world. And in some of the developed world, it's actually reverted. But what's happened historically is that the things that we've done in the land, we've converted the land to agricultural lands or grasslands. We've cut down forests and harvested wood. And essentially what we've done from an atmospheric perspective is that we've increased the release of CO2 from the systems and decreased the uptake. And the net effect is an increase in CO2 in the atmosphere. So that's carbon loss from the ecosystems and an increase in the atmospheric carbon dioxide. And the idea behind biosequestration is that this can be reversed. If we change our practices, the ecosystems can regain some of that carbon, and effectively we can reduce our losses or increase uptake. So reduce tillage, more productivity, changes back to how the land was used previously. We can draw down that CO2 in the atmosphere. And this is, I think, very appealing, because it's one of the few ways that we have right now of economically, feasibly drawing down CO2 from the atmosphere. We talk a lot about emission reductions. This is one way to draw down CO2. And there are a lot of questions. A lot of my research focuses on what practices we might use, where they might be most beneficial, how much carbon dioxide they might withdraw from the atmosphere, how quickly it'll happen, and lots of questions like that. Lots of unanswered questions. But the general idea, I think, is sound. But of course, one of the things and I want you to keep this picture in mind when we go through the next couple of pictures. Of course, the reason people do this is not because they hate forests or because they love the way this looks. It's because they want to make a living, and they want to, usually they use this land to raise cattle. This, again, is taken in that same area in Brazil, but it could be in Queensland. And so what they've done is cut down the forest and produce pasture land and living. And you can imagine how representative to an international negotiation for the Framework Convention on Climate Change thinks when he sees a figure that shows shifts in land use that lead to a net uptake in land and ties that to what's happening in the tropical rainforest. His concern is these people, the people he's representing. They're doing this to make a living just as we've done this in Australia and in the US and the rest of the developed world. And this is something that creates fear in the minds of the negotiators from developing countries. They fear that this idea that the land is used for people to make a living is lost in negotiations. And in a lot of the discussions I see, that piece does just fall out. We fail to think about how that land is used, but that's critically important. And I think that what we need to think about, and we don't really have the tools to do this, we need to think about how using different pieces of land affects greenhouse gas emissions per unit food produced. Right now the discussion is about sequestration as a means of offset, but I think we need to think a little bit more critically about how we're using the land and how the benefits that we're getting in terms of food production and the costs in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And so I think that this framework, thinking about greenhouse gas intensity, is useful for talking about sequestration and the limits of sequestration. Not much work has been done to think about this. And it's a little bit difficult to discuss because we don't have information that allows us to talk about greenhouse gas intensity on a plot of land. We don't have accounting rules that even tell us how to do that. So it's a little bit challenging. But we're actively thinking about these things and thinking about ways to evaluate different land uses in different places in terms of their benefits and costs in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. Now, another example. So I'm just going to talk about two examples today. And the other example that I want to talk about is nitrous oxide. And I talked to somebody yesterday from the Brisbane Times, and I'm pretty excited about these results that I'm going to present. And I might have been a little bit overexcited about talking about the N2O emission work, and I didn't. Well, maybe I wasn't clear. But the headline in the story on the website today was, "Forget carbon," researcher says. I don't for a minute suggest that we forget about carbon dioxide, carbon sequestration. I think these are crucial issues. If you look at the human impact on the atmosphere, most of the impact is through carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide. But I think that there's a lot of scope for reducing nitrous oxide emissions in agriculture. And I'm pretty optimistic that there are some things that can be done once we start learning a little bit about how to characterize our emissions in terms of the benefits that we get in terms of food produced. So we've started to do a little bit of work in this area, and the results that I'm reporting are just very preliminary results. We haven't published these yet, but I think they're very interesting. And so these first two panels, the top one shows yield, and this is over time from the early 60s until about 2000, 2005 for countries that are grouped in different ways. And so we've got this green line representing the rich countries. We have these big emerging economies, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, that are sometimes lumped together when people talk about greenhouse gases, because those countries are bigger and different than many of the other developing countries. And then this yellow line represents the rest of the countries, the developing countries, and then the white line's the world average. So here at the top we have yield, and here in this panel we have nitrogen inputs. And you can see that in all regions of the world, yield is increasing. You see some talk about changes in the rates of increase over time and concerns that we're going to run out of food because we're not advancing yield as much as possible. I don't want to talk about that today. Nitrogen inputs are growing as well. You can see that nitrogen inputs and yield are higher in the rich countries than in either the BRICS or the developing countries. You can see a pretty dramatic increase in nitrogen inputs in these BRICS countries, and that's driven by China largely. And it even offsets a pretty substantial decline in fertilization rates in Russia. But you can see that these are both moving up in tandem. And what I'm interested in is what the implications of this are for how efficiently nitrogen is used and how efficiently we can grow crops per unit greenhouse gas produced. And so these are data that, these are world data that we've assembled from a number of different sources, and we've developed some tools that allow us to merge those data together to produce these next figures, showing what we call the recovery efficiency of nitrogen. So this is of nitrogen that's added to crops. So this is fertilizer, nitrogen in manure, and deposited in. Of the nitrogen that's added to crops, this is the proportion that's recovered. And so in the rich countries, about half is recovered. In the developing countries, less is recovered. So countries with higher rates of nitrogen inputs actually are more efficient in recovering that nitrogen. Now, from my perspective as an ecosystem ecologist, I would have guessed the opposite. We think, and some high-profile papers have been published in places like Science and Nature saying that the opposite is happening. That in the rich countries we have productive systems, but they're high input. Lots of nitrogen is added to these systems. And we know that on a plot level, that if you increase the fertilization rate, that you get diminishing returns in terms of productivity. But what these data are showing us is that yield is growing in tandem with inputs, and efficiency is rather flat. So as nitrogen inputs are growing, the crops are able to harvest more nitrogen. We are able to harvest more nitrogen. And the proportion that we harvest hasn't changed very much over time. And I think, as interestingly, the rich countries in our crops, we're able to harvest more of the nitrogen that we put on than are the developing countries. And so in developing countries where fertilization rates are lower, you might say nitrogen is a more precious resource. It's more important. For a lot of reasons, they're not able to use it as efficiently. And what are these reasons? We haven't done any work to tease that apart, but I can tell you that there are a lot of them. We can think about a couple extremes. Think about seeds that don't germinate. If we use a lot of nitrogen or a little bit of nitrogen on seeds that don't germinate, we get low efficiency. If we use a little bit of nitrogen on plants that aren't well adapted to the conditions, we don't get very high nitrogen use efficiency. If we apply nitrogen but the plants don't have access to micronutrients or water, we get reduced nitrogen use efficiency. And so there are a lot of factors that enable crops and plants to take advantage of nitrogen inputs. And I think that what our data are suggesting is that in the rich countries, growth of nitrogen inputs has been in tandem with growth in the ability of plants to take advantage of those inputs. I think that's what these data are suggesting. And that growth in fertilization rates you could say the same thing for developing countries, but they've been less efficient over time. Now, if we look at this last panel, this is a measure of nitrous oxide emission per unit yield. You can see that the rich countries are doing better in terms of N2O per unit yield. So in other words, more crop is produced per unit N2O emitted. The systems are highly productive, but they're more efficient in terms of greenhouse gas productivity. And I think we haven't published these results yet, and I'll be interested to hear some feedback. But they surprise me, and I think they're quite interesting. And we have data these are data for cereals. We have data for several different crops, by crop and by country. I just amalgamated them in that previous figure to illustrate the points. But I think there's some interesting patterns between countries as well. And this figure shows it's got the same color scheme here. Each of these blocks represents a different country. Some of them are labeled. The top 10 producers, I think, are labeled. For 1963 and for 2005. On this axis, you can see the proportion of total crop production. And so the big bars represent big producers. And you can see those have changed over time. The composition has changed over time. And these bars are ordered according to the fertilization input rates within these given years. So the countries here at the bottom have high fertilization rates. The countries at the top have low fertilization rates. And that's on this part of this axis. And here is the efficiency in terms of recovery of nitrogen in grain divided by the nitrogen inputs. And you can see that moving from, as the previous figure showed, moving from 1963 to 2005, fertilizer inputs have grown. The distribution of the big producers has grown. Interestingly, as I mentioned, China is a big fertilizer user. Higher, according to our data, higher fertilization rates than in the U.S. and much higher. Australia's not labeled here, but it's up there at the top. Very high fertilization rates and low efficiency of use. But you can see there's a lot of variability here. A lot of variability here in efficiency of use. And I think that that's reason to be optimistic. That particularly in the developing countries and in the BRICS countries, there are lots of things that can be done to increase their efficiency of nitrogen use. If the crops can be supplemented to take better advantage of the nitrogen that they are using, they can increase yields without increasing nitrogen use and increase their efficiency in terms of greenhouse gas production per unit crop produced. So again, I think these data are quite different and interesting, and really I think there's some reasons for optimism in looking closely at these data. So in conclusion, I just want to read through these points real quickly. I think that emissions from agriculture are a little bit different than emissions generally. I think that starting from that Kaya identity framework, it helps us understand where the opportunities are for emission reductions and increasing efficiency of the system. Short of having discussions about whether we should eat meat, what the population should be, whether we should support birth control in war, or prevent birth control, or support birth control, or prevent war, or not prevent war, things that I don't want to talk about, but often come into these loud debates. But agriculture is different because it's a non-point source primarily of emissions. There's this big opportunity for drawdown through sequestration. I think it's pretty unlikely to reduce food consumption. Increasing food consumption is a good thing. And in agriculture, we don't have this decarbonization option will address some of agricultural emissions, but we don't know how to grow food without emitting greenhouse gases. We can increase the efficiency by which we do that, but we can't set it to zero. Whereas in the energy-related emissions, we can envision very low CO2 emitters per unit energy produced. It's possible to imagine clean fuel, but for food production, we don't have that opportunity, or it's limited because energy is such a small component of the emissions. And that's really an important thing that distinguishes those. And I think that increasing the efficiency of our food productions is really essential for reducing greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. There will be growth in food production and consumption in the future to meet the demands of a growing planet. I think we need to figure out how to grow that food more efficiently. And I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thanks.